Here's a panel I'm really looking forward to with one of the greatest statesmen of the transatlantic relationship and the best historian of the 1989 generation, to examine the history of this vital partnership and how we've gotten to this point. I'll now turn to Dr. Esther Brimmer, Atlantic Council Board Director and the Executive Director and CEO of NAFSA, to introduce our next distinguished guests.
Thank you so much, and welcome to the first session. I am honored to open the conversation with two of our great thinkers in the transatlantic space, Secretary Madeleine Albright and Professor Timothy Garton Ash. As you know, Secretary Albright served as Secretary of State from 1997 to 2001, and previously was the permanent representative to the United Nations, New York. He's also a professor at Georgetown and a prolific writer. Professor Timothy Garton Ash has written extensively on ideas and European history, and also shares his ideas with the wider public in his column in The Guardian as well. So we have, as I say, two of our great thinkers at the intersection of ideas and policy who will open our conversation today. So in this session, we will ask, how can the shared transatlantic values help guide our alliance as we address challenges of the 21st century? And just to kick off, I'd like to ask you both, the transatlantic community can argue that it won the Cold War and since has nurtured the flower of democracy. Yet authoritarian trends are evident in several countries. Have we lost the promise of open societies, or are we about to enter a new stage? What do you see for the outlook of liberal democracy in our space, and what should we do about it? The floor is open. Go ahead.
Well, I thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be on this program. Esther, you and I have known each other a very long time, and Timothy is somebody that I have read and admired over the years as probably the most knowledgeable person about what has gone on in the evolution in Central and Eastern Europe and Europe generally. So I'm really delighted. So to answer your question, I'm an optimist, but I worry a lot. And I am concerned about some of the trends that you mentioned because there are more of those than I had expected, frankly, having been part of what I would call the euphoric generation at the end of the Cold War, where we really did believe that democratic practices would take hold and that Central and Eastern Europe had been kept behind bars artificially, and that it would become a Europe whole and free. And I think we have faced and looked at what some of the issues are, why they have happened, and I hope that that's something that we can explore, because I think, Timothy, you have spent so much time also thinking about this, and I have become kind of more self-critical about what we didn't do, and I'd love to know kind of how you see that.
Yes, well, thank you. Well, first of all, let me say it's a huge pleasure to be doing this with Madeleine Albright, who I've so much admired for so many years. And also at a time when America is back. I can't tell you what a relief it is to say those words. As we speak, Secretary Blinken is in London speaking with the leaders, not just of other G7 countries, but also of other democracies, which I hope we'll come to because it's a very important point about the widening of the West. And everything President Biden has said about China and Russia thus far seems to me absolutely spot on. So there's a reason for optimism straight off. Nonetheless, Madeleine, I do so much agree that I think in the 2000s, more than in the 1990s, we became complacent. We believed that the victory was secure, mission accomplished. Having seen this absolutely extraordinary expansion of the democratic world, particularly in Europe, let's remember, starting with Spain and Portugal and Greece, then going to the whole of Central and Eastern Europe, then to Southeastern Europe, culminating in the pro-European Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And we thought this is the direction of history. And it's always a mistake if you think you know the direction of history. So history has taught us otherwise. Number one, in our own old established democracies, like the United States, but also the United Kingdom, we've had major challenges to consolidated liberal democracies. But number two, we have the shocking situation that we have a full member state of the European Union, Hungary, which is no longer a democracy. It's not just an illiberal democracy, which essentially is a contradiction in terms. It's no longer a democracy, and yet a full member state of the European Union. So I think the first challenge we face, Esther, is not so much external, the authoritarian pushback from China and Russia and Turkey, which of course we'll come to, but the internal challenge in our own societies.
Are there particular steps that you think should be taken, indeed, to reinforce democratic principles in our own societies? Is this work that has to be done internally, or how can Friends and Allies help?
Madeleine.
Well, I think it has to be done both ways, because part of the strength of the Euro-Atlantic Alliance has been our interaction and working together on things. I have always, I have my special way of saying this, is that I'm a perfect example of the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, having been born in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and then being raised in the United States. And so I've decided often when I meet with my European colleagues, given my background, I can say what I really think. And I do think that I am very troubled about Hungary specifically, what we are not doing or could be doing more of. And I think part of the issue is trying to sort out what happened in Hungary and why. I think many of us knew Orban when he was our favorite dissident. And I had gone to Hungary to meet him in the 80s and then invited him to come to the United States. So what happened and why? And are those particular elements present in other places? And how should the European Union and NATO react to having a member that is so totally out of line? And whether we have the tools, frankly, to make clear that this is unacceptable, because the voting and everything within our system makes it very complicated since you require consensus. And so there are a number of methods that I think we need to look at more specifically.
So could I just add to that? I mean, first of all, I'm also a living, breathing Euro-Atlanticist, since my academic life is divided between Oxford and Stanford. In my unbiased opinion, the two greatest universities in the world. But just to add to what Madeleine said, a couple of points. First of all, I think the Biden administration's emphasis on democracy, human rights, and free speech is tremendously important, because it robs nationalist populists like Viktor Orban and Jarosław Kaczynski, but also others elsewhere in Europe, of a major supporter, which they had in the White House, in Donald Trump. And the US still matters enormously symbolically, as Madeleine knows so well, in Central and Eastern Europe. What the US can do operationally, I think, is one has to be a bit more nuanced, because the US doesn't have the unique power that it had in the 1990s when the enlargement of NATO was on the agenda. But there are quite particular areas, like, for example, media freedom, which is now the front line of the battle for democracy in Poland, where the US, the biggest independent television station in Poland, is owned by the Discovery Channel. There's an example for you, where the US can have a specific impact. But frankly, Esther, now much more important is the European Union. Madeleine mentioned tools. And the tragedy is that the European Union had all the tools to help the transition to democracy, while the fragile new democracies of Central and Eastern Europe were trying to get into the EU. But it turns out we have virtually no tools to keep them democracies once they are full member states. On the contrary, we send billions of euros in EU funds, which actually help the populist rulers. In effect, they can use them for electoral purposes, for purposes of patronage, with virtually no conditionality. So in my view, the primary challenge is to the European Union to make what I would call the linkage between the Europe of values and the Europe of money.
It is fascinating to look at many elements of that, particularly the freedom of speech and freedom of the media, as you've identified as an important element within liberal democracy. And indeed, that the discussion of how to manage free speech and the internet world has been a crucial issue in the transatlantic conversation. Indeed, it's been an area where the United States and the European Union have often taken very different approaches to the management of the big tech companies that are provide the platforms for some of this various free speech. What do you see as the important steps to take in the thinking about free speech and what freedom of the media means in an internet era where all sorts of ideas can spread very quickly? How does that US-EU conversation play into free speech in the internet age?
I think the truth is that it is one of the hardest discussions, because whereas we think we have similar values, and we do on most things, we do not very much on the issue of privacy, and that there really are quite different approaches that are coming out of Brussels than come out of the United States government. And so that is one of the issues. And the question is whether there is some way to develop kind of rules of the game. I hate to compare this to arms control, but it took a long time to kind of really get some of the rules down. We need to have some larger system to look at what needs to be done, because we really do have some disagreement specifically with the Europeans on this. Especially since information is now the new tool. By the way, one of my academic interests has always been the role of information and political change. And I wrote my dissertation on the Czechoslovak press in 1968, and then wrote about solidarity. And so I really do think that this is one of the key aspects of how democracy works in terms of information. And yet at the moment, it is the most questionable aspect, since even in the United States, we're unclear about where our information is coming from, and people listening to only what they agree with already. So this is the major issue of the 21st century. And I do think that it's important for us to talk about it head on.
I think we need to talk across the Atlantic a lot about this. I think it needs to be high up the agenda. I mean, first of all, the values we have in common, in a sense, go back all the way to ancient Greece. And of course, at the very foundation of democracy in ancient Greece, there was the agora, the pnyx, the place where people met. They were given all the facts. They were given all the different arguments and views. They debated them and they came to a decision. And we're losing that shared public sphere in all our democracies. So that's extremely worrying. A lot of this is still about local and national media. We shouldn't spend all the time talking about the internet, because actually television, national television, is still fantastically important. Fox News is probably more important than Facebook, right? And TVN in Poland is more important than Facebook. On the internet, the position is this. As you know, Esther, I spent many years writing a big book about free speech in a connected world. The position is this: there is one coherent, consistently applied model of internet regulation in the world today. That is the Chinese model. And it is a model which is the internet without freedom. That's the competition. And our problem is that we're all at sixes and sevens. What we used to call the free world is, as Madeleine said, all over the place, with Americans lobbing, word bombs at Facebook and Google, and Americans lobbing word bombs back. The fact is, America is the trendsetter on the internet, and Europe is the norm setter of the internet. So if only we could get together and put those two things together and find some common, I would say, norms as much as rules, because it's as much about the norms as it is about specific regulation. That would mean that there would be, so to speak, a model of the internet and free speech in free countries to put against the extremely powerful, increasingly powerful and dynamic Chinese model.
If the transatlantic community were able to develop a set of norms in this area, in what ways would they need to reach out to other democracies around the world to help make this a more global norm? How do these transatlantic norms in this area spread to a global level to counteract a more authoritarian version?
I think this is where what President Biden has been talking about really comes in terms of a summit for democracy, not a summit of democracies. And so there is a way to be looking at what the evolution is and what needs to be done, and the fact that it isn't just a set of countries, because one of the hard parts, frankly, I was involved in something called Community for Democracies that we did in Warsaw, because one of our friends, Bronislaw Goremek, had wanted the adjective Warsaw associated with something different than the pact. But we had a hard time deciding who should be invited. How do you even decide? And that the idea was to kind of talk about best practices, which I do think continues to be an important part. But I do think that what President Biden has in mind in terms of enlarging the group and having it be a summit for democracies is something that has to be followed out. Having read the paper this morning, I gather that Tony Blinken, as he is in London, they're beginning to talk about what the various steps would be in terms of enlarging the group. But it can't just be the Western democracies, because as Timothy said, some of the challenge comes from a totally different part of the world, where information is used to limit rather than to expand.
So I think this is absolutely the great strategic challenge. I actually wrote a book out of the Iraq crisis in 2004, which was called Free World, which made precisely the argument that the future for the West was to go beyond the West, the enlargement of the West to include democracies in other continents and cultures. So I think that the Biden administration is absolutely on the right line. After all, when it comes to dealing with China, India, Japan, and Australia, frankly, are more important than Germany, France, and Britain, let alone other European countries. So it's right geopolitically, it's right geoeconomically, because these are rising economic powers. And for me, this means being careful, Esther, about how we speak about our values. I think we now have to be a little bit careful about speaking about European values or Western values in an exclusive way, as if they only belong to us. We have to go back to the universalist spirit of the Enlightenment and take seriously the notion that they are universal values. And if I'm going to speak about free speech in Asia, I would rather find you the quotation from the Emperor Ashoka in India or Confucius in China, and you can find those quotes, which expresses the same universal value, but in the words of thinkers from other cultures. And I think that's actually, although it may seem a slightly academic point, I think it's quite an important point about the way we speak to the rest of the world of democracy.
Indeed. I'm, of course, cautious in the presence of leading professors to make this point, but I'll say one of my favorite documents I used to put on my syllabus was actually UNESCO document #1, which was actually a pamphlet that was a collection of views of authors from around the world, includes Gandhi wrote for India, for example, Aldous Huxley for the UK, but on human rights. And it was one of the supporting documents for the creation of the Universal Declaration. And so what was fascinating was, they say in just one document, one short document, just tries to get this idea that writing from their own national and cultural traditions, they could come to this discussion of universality, but from their own traditions. It's an interesting slice on looking at that question in particular.
If I may just add a word there, it seems to me there's a corollary to that, which is a bit more challenging, which is that there are some core values which we really do share, but it's not necessarily the whole Western package as we promoted it in the 1990s, where we sometimes spoke as if there was, so to speak, an entire package for a liberal democracy, economy, culture, and society, which you could go and buy at IKEA. And if you could understand the instructions, you could put it together. And I think we have to shift slightly and understand that maybe a consequence of having a wider commonwealth of or community of democracies or community for democracy is that the shared ground may be slightly smaller.
I do think that one of the things we need to be aware of, this is unlike me to say this, is to not get caught up in the same kind of post-Cold War euphoria, thinking that this is something that is easy to do. And I have been talking about some mega trends and their downside. So, and we have been beneficiaries, for instance, of globalization. Just look at us here. But it does have a downside. It's faceless. And so people want to know what their identities are, where we come from, religion, etc. And that's fine unless my identity hates your identity, which then becomes nationalism, and hyper-nationalism undercuts where the direction that we want to go in. The other mega trend is technology, which has done the most incredible things to unite us. And I always love to talk about the Kenyan woman farmer who no longer has to walk hundreds of miles every year to pay her bills. She can do it on her mobile phone. But what it has also done, the downside, is disaggregate voices. And we don't know where people are getting their information. And more recently, I think that there is another mega trend that one needs to look at, which is despite the fact that there's kind of the Internet of Things, your refrigerator talks to you, it has created fragmentation even more so. So I do think in order to do the kinds of things that we need to do, that Timothy's been talking about, you've been talking about, we do need to understand the reality within which we are operating and where some of the tools are working against us. I have believed all along that we're all the same and people want to make decisions about their lives. That's what democracy is about. But I think that we need to understand exactly what are the downside of some of the things. And that's what makes me worry. And that's why, and I want to stay being an optimist and idealist, but we need to know what we're facing.
Yeah, can I add just a specific illustration of what Madeleine just said about technology? You know, people go on and on about Facebook's decisions about who to leave up and who to take down. I think even today, the oversight board is deciding whether to put Donald Trump back up. I don't know if they've yet decided. That's not the key. The key is the working of the algorithms of Facebook, which, because they optimize for attention, and the extreme and the sensational and the often untrue gets the most attention, facilitate this polarization and extremism and fake news. So you actually have to go to the heart of a major American company and look at the algorithm deep in its computers to get at what is a profound political and cultural problem, namely how we actually restore a proper shared public sphere.
What does this mean for our social contract? In effect, we have automation changing the nature of work and the ability to sustain oneself economically. But then we also realize that there are deep rifts in our social fabric. Among the many things that the COVID-19 pandemic has done, in addition to taking so many lives, has actually been to expose even more clearly the frayed social fabric of our societies and the very differential experience of different people, even within our liberal democracies. Where do we start to reknit that social fabric?
Well, I do think the social contract is broken, and we do need to have honest discussions about that, what we owe to each other. I think that there are discussions that are going on in the United States, I think very vividly at the moment, in terms of the social contract is based on the fact that people gave up some of their individual rights in order to have the government do a set of things, which is what's under discussion: protection, building roads, etc. And I do think what's interesting is that in the ideas that President Biden is putting forward, they go to the basis of the social contract. And we are seeing the problems because there are those in our system that, rather than trying to find a social contract, are exacerbating those differences. And so I think we are at a very key time in terms of what needs to be done in exactly addressing that question, because that is the day-to-day business at the moment.
So could I just add to that? I mean, if you look at the causes of populism, and I have behind me a whole shelf full of books on the causes of populism, you can see that it partly arises from the failings of a one-dimensional economic liberalism, which neglected the needs for both solidarity and equality on the one hand and community and identity on the other. Solidarity and equality being a value more typically associated with the left, and Biden is doing a great deal about that at the moment with the multi-trillion-dollar packages. Community and identity, I mean, we liberal internationalists rather neglected the national community and left it to the nationalists, so that I think we have to reclaim a liberal patriotism. But I would say that I think the post-COVID era will be very difficult for this, because whereas the COVID time itself has been bad for populists. They're good at rhetoric, they're not good at competence, at governing, at rolling out vaccines. But I think the post-COVID recovery with enormous levels of public debt, I mean, look at the Southern European countries, soaring up to Second World War levels, significant insecurity, a generation of young people who haven't got the jobs they might otherwise have got, and potentially high inflation, you know, those are pretty good conditions for populists. So I think we've got a real challenge on our hands to do the right things and to do them quite fast.
What's the role of education in all of this? If we think, and I'll take particularly higher education, that indeed embedded in President Biden's proposals include the idea of support for what we call the United States community colleges, which are two-year institutions in the tertiary sector, and different countries have sort of different versions of this. But the idea that the states, in a sense, should support education through at least 2 more years of education. And indeed, education has been a fundamental part of the European Union. We think of the Erasmus program, of course, the European Union's Erasmus Plus 2021 to 2027. It's over 26 billion euros have been committed to it, and even the United States, and actually now these days the United Kingdom, are partner countries. They're not program countries, but partner countries of the Erasmus program. So what role does international education or education play in building values in the next generation, for a generation that faces uncertainty?
So I would love to say, give us lots more money to Oxford and Stanford, but just entre nous, you know, Stanford isn't necessarily the neediest of institutions in higher education. I think the emphasis really needs to be, and you mentioned community colleges, so to speak, rather at the other end, if I can put it that way, because one of the things that went wrong over the last 30 years is that our societies were divided rather sharply down the middle between, you know, the roughly 50% who went to university and the other half who didn't. And that became itself a cultural cause of nationalist populism. So I think things like community colleges, further education, as we call it in Britain, technical education, at which Germany is so good, both providing more and better, but also recognition for it, to recognize that the only test of value and call for respect is not to have, you know, a BA or an MA or a doctorate. It's also other kinds of education. But just frankly, Esther, I don't know what Madeleine thinks on this, but I think schools are even more important. I think in terms of civic integration, I think it's incredible that we don't have compulsory classes on digital literacy, starting at primary school, for example.
I obviously here we're people that are very much involved in the educational world. And so we're for it. And I do think I agree with what Timothy has said in terms of the level of education, and that it also does have to go down into the primary schools and high schools. I do think something that has to happen, and I don't quite know how to state this, but I think that the education has to lead to jobs, so that I think Timothy, you were talking about the Germans. I mean, they have a whole intern kind of program on this, because we have a new younger generation that wants to be employed. And so while it's nice to have an education of every level. I do think it has to have, I don't know how to, this practical effect, because people need to know, they identify themselves by what their job is. Who are they? Are they able to live in our new societies? And so there needs to be a respect for education, a respect for exchanging difficult ideas, but also there has to be, to go to the social contract we were talking about, a way that they lead to jobs.
Although, if I may just add to that, I don't know what Madeleine thinks about this, but it seems to me that, you know, this is potentially a kind of post-45 moment, in the sense that I'm not persuaded that with automation and AI coming down the road and globalization, we are actually going to be able to provide really good full-time jobs for everybody. I think that's going to be incredibly demanding. And therefore, I think we have to start thinking about a social contract which maybe involves more part-time work, more flexible working. But then you have to think of social provision by the state, by the welfare state. So I think it's that whole nexus of jobs and basic social security that to some extent we have to rethink.
What is the role of the private sector? We have, of course, large companies, large and small, that thrive and work in the transatlantic space, and globally for that matter. And whether it's local businesses or global businesses, they are important fabric of our societies. What's the role of those entities that are economic leaders in our transatlantic space, in the connection between education and work, in this question of equity, which is one of the places we debate this, is equity in the workplace. So what's the role of the private sector in our transatlantic community and in the supporting some of the values we've discussed?
Well, I think the private sector has a very large part to play. And I am a great believer in public-private partnerships, something that I was interested in when I was in office, but also afterwards. But it requires the private sector being brought in early. If we're talking about international institutions even, I think it's important to have the private sector at the table early, so that it isn't just a matter of bringing the private sector in to pay for things, but also to be part of the thinking that has to take place. Just in the few minutes that we've been talking, it is clear that there's an awful lot of thinking that needs to take place, and pushing in terms of having different kinds of ideas. And that often does come from the private sector. But I keep saying this over and over again, the private sector is composed of non-governmental organizations, but also businesses. And there is a different way of approaching things, and we need to speak to each other earlier.
Yes, I'm slightly tempted to start by giving you a flip European, a very European answer, which is, it would be nice if Facebook would pay a bit more taxes. That would help. I don't know if you saw the recent figures on their extraordinary income in Luxembourg, on which they paid no tax at all. So I think there is an issue next to the free speech issue around what I call the private superpowers, these absolutely giant Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, and so on, where I think we need to spend a lot of time is looking at small and medium-sized enterprises, which of course is a great strength of the German economy, what the Germans call the Mittelstand. And I think, Britain and America too can do a hell of a lot more with small and medium-sized enterprises. Could I add one other point, Esther, which is, because I think we're coming towards the end, a sort of meta point here. It's interesting, we've spent so much time talking about change in our own societies, inside our own societies, inside the transatlantic community. And I think that's exactly right, because I would submit to you the proposition as a historian that the most important single thing the West did to win the Cold War was to keep our own societies dynamic, open, and attractive. So that's the first thing we have to do, is to make the West attractive again, because at the moment, people looking at the West as against China from Latin America or Africa, many people could say, well, I prefer the Chinese way.
I do think this adds to something that I believe we need to speak about, which is the rule of law, that in so many ways embodies the kinds of values and changes. And if you have the rule of law, then you have a system whereby there are people pay taxes or whatever the various parts are, but there's some agreement on values. And I'd love to bring something up because I saw that when this was being introduced, President Čaputová of Slovakia started speaking. And what is interesting is they now are really kind of an example of the possibilities of a country that didn't have a lot of rule of law, all of a sudden being champions of it, being stuck, frankly, geographically between two countries that are the opposite, which is Hungary and what's going on in Poland. And therefore, understanding the centrality of the rule of law to what we're talking about, I think is very important. It brings rules about how private sector behaves. It brings a variety of ways that governments are organized that one could have some agreement on. And so I do think we might look at that also as one of the things, as a sign of something, Timothy, don't you think, in terms of how the societies have emerged?
I so much agree. You know, Ralph Dahrendorf and I were friends and intellectual comrades, and one thing we agreed on shortly before his untimely death was that in the 1990s, when we all promoted the holy trinity of multi-party democracy, free market economy, and civil society, it should have been a quadriga. The rule of law should have been emphasized as much as the other three. And I think, you know, we missed that. But here's an optimistic note, Esther, and it picks up what Madeleine just said about Slovakia. An optimistic view of nationalist populism in East Central Europe is that it's like the infection you get from a vaccine to stimulate the antibodies. Because in the 1990s and 2000s, the Poles, for example, Poles as in Poland, rather took the rule of law, independent courts, all that stuff for granted. It was just stuff you did in order to be a proper modern country. Now they are so much under attack, the society is mobilizing to defend them in a quite impressive way. And actually, for the first time in 200 years, judges are becoming heroes. People are actually standing up specifically for the rule of law. And I even saw a demonstration in Krakow in Poland the other day, where the chant being chanted by the crowd was triple separation of powers, triple separation of powers. There are not many countries where you get crowds chanting separation of powers. So that a constitutional patriotism is actually, I think, being generated precisely by the viral attack of populism.
Do you see other cases where we're seeing it's that popular defense of liberal democracy, and indeed, as you say, the important role of the rule of law and support for that? Is that something that we are seeing around the globe as well? In other words, are there enough local responses or the elements of local responses to help with the spread of these broader values?
Yes, Myanmar. If you look at what is going on in terms of a military coup and the kinds of demonstrations that are taking place there by people that believe in having some kind of a role in the way that their country works, and that democracy is not just a Western value. I think it is worth looking at what is going on there specifically. And
let me add Russia. Not only the absolutely incredible courage of Navalny, in a real, I mean, what an extraordinary example of courage, but also the courage of the young Russians who are going out on the streets knowing they're going to get beaten up and arrested. And people, by the way, in Siberia, not in the big cities, metropolises, who are also going out on the streets and engaging in his smart voting tactics. So I think, you know, we were too optimistic about Russia. Of course, we were too optimistic about Russia, but one day our optimism may actually be justified And I'm a short-term pessimist. I'd be interested to hear Madeleine on this. I'm a short-term pessimist because obviously Putin is completely ruthless and has the thing very much under control, but a medium to long-term optimist.
I agree. It is fascinating to watch what they're doing. Although we do have to recognize that we're dealing with a former KGB agent who knows how to undermine the various aspects of what we've been talking about, especially in the part of the world that is fragile in terms of some of the things. So we have an awful lot to do, and which I think goes back to some of the things we were talking about, which is how the Biden administration sees what needs to be done and isn't just kind of focused on small groups of people. It's an understanding that we have to do something about our own democracy, but understanding that this is a larger movement that needs to be supported by democratic countries so that it really is able to take hold in other parts of the world.
I also think that Europe needs to do more. I really do. It's now a partnership of equals, and I really think in this respect, as in others, Europe needs to do more. I mean, my own personal view is that one shouldn't keep banging on too much about 2% on military spending. You know, it's going to take Germany, particularly with Greens in the government, a very long time to get to 2% on military spending. But ask the Germans and other Europeans to step up to the plate in other fields, which are really important. That would be my suggestion.
And could I suggest also that the Western Europeans become less snobbish about Central and East Europeans? That is something that I, just observing, find very troublesome. I don't know if you agree with that, Timothy.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, of course, it started with Jacques Chirac's famous comments that they were not very well brought up and better keep silent. But as you very well know, this is an ancient West European stereotype that goes all the way back to Voltaire and Rousseau and the Enlightenment. And we hear it immediately emerging again when we criticize Hungary. What you sometimes hear from the, say, the French, for example, is, oh, you know, they've never really been part of post-Enlightenment Europe, right? They've always been tendentially slightly barbaric and authoritarian. So one really has to watch out for that extremely arrogant stereotype in a country where Marine Le Pen is running neck and neck with Emmanuel Macron in the polls. And we have Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
Indeed, indeed. We have just a few moments left. Looking around the globe, what would be your priority list? And is there a particular role for institutions? In other words, whether it's formal institutions, global or regional, through which the US and the EU should work in addition to their direct relationship? Are there any institutional aspects that should be part of our priority list?
Timothy.
Right. Tactical priority, Russia. Strategic priority, China. Clearly, longer term, China is the great challenge to the emerging superpower. And it is the one where, as Madeleine mentioned, China, along with Russia, is indulging in lots of divide and rule in Europe. So we really have to get our act together. Institutionally, I would say two things. First of all, thank heaven we haven't talked at all about Brexit, but I think finding some groupings, like I think it's called the Quint, where you can work with the British government along with key European governments would be helpful for Washington. But however, if I was coming to Europe as the US president, I would of course talk about NATO and of course talk about the G7, but I would make a particular point about talking about the European Union, because that is now the central institution of the European project.
I agree. And for Americans, we need to understand the European Union better. And it is complex in its structure, but it is the natural partner for some of the things that we've been talking about.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. Well, indeed, since we come back to the European Union and the centrality of the European Union and the United States in the transatlantic relationship, we're basically coming up on time, and I know we will be heading over to the next session momentarily. And just to say, any last words at this point before we wrap up and hand back over to the next session?
First of all, I'm very glad that we had a chance to talk about this, and nothing gives me greater pleasure than spending time listening to Timothy, who really has had the most remarkable really approach to this, both historical and optimistic and idealistic. What could be better?
Well, that's much too kind of you, Madeleine. How could I not repay it with equal compliments and your extraordinary role in building the transatlantic relationship, particularly, of course, in the enlargement of NATO, but also in the relationship with the EU. I would have to say that although we have huge problems, and I still think that I feel a whole lot more optimistic about the future of the transatlantic relationship and our shared values and interests that I did a couple of years ago.
And Esther, thank you so much. It's great to have you be the coordinator. Indeed. And so much of what you do and have done for a long, we've known each other a very, very long time. So.
We have, and thank you. It was an honor to sit with you and hear your conversation. I'd like to extend thanks both to Secretary Albright and to Professor Garton. Thank you very much.
All the best.
Thanks.